So the trailer for the Rings of Power series has finally been released, along with a few more snippets of information about the series like the Vanity Fair articles and the character posters, so let's talk about it. And straight away I know what you're thinking. The trailer came out like a week ago and you're only just doing a reaction video? Well, my answer to that is that this isn't late, it's arriving precisely when it means to. We need to move away from this expectation that people must immediately form an opinion about whether something is good or bad. Sometimes we need time to mull things over, revisit them and let them settle before we truly know what we think.
I get it. Don't be hasty.
So take a walk with me because for the first time on this channel, it's time to get real. Do you recognize where I am? No? Does this tree look familiar at all? Okay, let me jog your memory. This is the exact spot where the very first shots of Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy were put to film. The hobbits came rolling down that bank, found some mushrooms about here, then hid from the Nazgul under this tree. Oh, huh. Okay, so it turns out that the tree they hid under was a custom-made prop, but if you get off the road, you can still see the ledge here that the hobbits hid against. Even without the tree, standing here you can still almost hear the hooves of the approaching ringwraith. There's no place like nature to compose your thoughts, and where better to compose your thoughts about a Tolkien adaptation than the place where the most iconic one began. Because even though the focus of this video will be on the trailer for the Rings of Power and the broader conversation around that adaptation, I will be drawing a lot of comparisons between the Amazon series and the Jackson trilogy. Because whatever flaws those movies may have, they remain the gold standard for adapting Tolkien to film. They are the definitive portrayal of his work in the minds of millions of people, so any live-action series based in Middle-earth should be expected to meet that standard. Tolkien deserves no less. We saw in the Hobbit trilogy what can happen when an adaptation goes too far with its creative license. So let's talk about the Rings of Power, and let me get something out of the way up front. I'm an optimist. I'm always hopeful that movies and TV shows will be good because I want to watch good movies and TV shows. I honestly don't get people who actively root for things to fail or who passionately and aggressively hate things before they've even had a chance to judge them on their merits. You know, the kinds of people who thought Heath Ledger being cast as the Joker would destroy the Batman franchise. And as you'll see from my channel, I also love all things Middle-earth, so of course I want the Rings of Power to be good because I want to have more quality adaptations of Tolkien's work in my life. I want the work of Tolkien to reach new people, and a well-made adaptation can inspire a whole new generation to delve greedily and deeply into his world. The trailer and the Vanity Fair previews have made me both more excited and more nervous for the Rings of Power, because based on what we have seen so far, this adaptation could still go either way, so let's look at what we know. Opening with Numenor was almost inevitable, and straight away it's fantastic to see the similarities in production design to the Jackson trilogy. Now I know that this series does not directly share a continuity with the Jackson films, but I am still glad to see that they have at least kept a thematic continuity. For most people, these movies are the definitive image of what Middle-earth looks like, but that's in no small part because the production design came from people like Alan Lee and John Howe, whose artwork had adorned Tolkien's books for years before the live-action films. So it makes sense for the Amazon series to also draw its inspiration from that same artwork. We see those parallels in Numenor, but not so much in the shot of Nori, whose design seems more reminiscent of the fairy tale-esque elements that we saw in the Hobbit films. It definitely made me raise an eyebrow, but this character design may be an exception because the only other thing in the trailer that really seems to echo this sort of aesthetic were the nomads. But frankly, in this shot, I was too distracted by the fact they are walking through what is unmistakably a New Zealand landscape. Vistas like this are a huge part of how we picture Middle-earth, and I am glad to see some real-world locations being used for the series. But then we have this shot of the Northern Waste, and it seems a bit jarring coming after this one because the landscape here and the waterfalls seem almost entirely digital, like the earlier shot of Numenor was. So it remains to be seen if scenes like this will be the exception or the rule, but I for one am really hoping that they made full use of New Zealand's epic landscapes, at least for the establishing shots of the key locations. Moving on, and Galadriel looks awesome here. Morfydd Clark looks like pitch perfect casting, and I am so glad that she will be a focal character for this series because Galadriel is one of the most intriguing characters in the Legendarium. Now look, I know that images like this one and some of the comments around her being the commander of the Northern Armies has set some alarm bells ringing about the show possibly changing her in-universe backstory and marginalizing her inherent magical powers so as to give her a more traditional action heroine role. Well, to that I would simply say this. One of the early promotional images for the Lord of the Rings trilogy was this. Predictably, people online started screaming about how this was a blight on Tolkien's legacy and started talking about Arwen Warrior Princess. They speculated wildly about how she was going to replace Éowyn or become part of the Fellowship, and how all of this was just PC gone mad. Well, it turned out that this scene was fucking awesome, and it made total sense in the context of the films to replace Glorfindel with Arwen for the flight to the Ford scene. So once again, I'm going to withhold judgment on Galadriel's role in the Rings of Power until after I have seen the whole thing.
Don't be hasty.
After a glimpse of the new character Halbrand on the raft, we then see Arondir, another new character, grab an arrow and launch it back at his attacker, which is possibly my favourite moment of the trailer. I just love seeing elven speed and reflexes in combat, but this brings us on to the thorny topic of this elf's appearance. This has proved to be a controversial element among the fandom because it seems to diverge from how Tolkien described the appearance of Sylvan elves. Well, that may be true, but it's 2022 and I for one have no problem with a short-haired elf. A core theme of Tolkien's work was that of fellowship. His work is about all sorts of different people setting aside their differences and working together, and I think it's great that the Amazon series is representing all sorts of diverse hairstyles, not just among the elves, but the dwarves too, one of whom controversially does not have a beard. That's the only thing that's controversial about these characters' appearances, right? Look, film adaptations of any literary character can result in them being very different from the original description. This is not by default a bad thing. Sometimes it makes sense in the context of the story being told on film. Like in the Lord of the Rings books, Frodo is 51, hobbits don't have very pointy ears, and Gandalf's eyebrows are supposed to extend beyond the brim of his hat. Gollum was supposed to be wearing dark clothes. You don't see fans ranting about how unfaithful that is to the books, just like you don't see fans ranting about how Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury is unfaithful to the comics, or that Jeffrey Wright's Felix Leiter is unfaithful to the Fleming books, because in these cases, the change from the literal book description is not, by itself, a bad thing. Fans accepted these changes because the characterization of those characters in the context of that story was still faithful to the source material, even though it was not a carbon copy of it. You often hear people say that Tolkien intended for Middle-earth to be a sort of mythology for England. Well, putting to one side the fact that that's not actually the current consensus of Tolkien scholars, even if it was true, the whole point of a mythology is to give people a common shared history that they can tell and retell over generations. In the same letter which Tolkien supposedly suggests this mythology idea, he goes on to say, "I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketched. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama." To the extent Tolkien wanted to create a mythology, he also wanted people to take that mythology and make it their own, and to fill in the sketches that he had left behind. I see no issue with the mythology of England being adapted for modern audiences in a way that reflects what that modern audience looks like, short-haired or not. The second half of the trailer is a collection of fairly straightforward shots that are designed to show off more of the production design and give clues as to the story, setting, and to introduce us to characters like Gil-galad, Durin, and Elrond. Like with Numenor, there is still a strong element of visual continuity with the Jackson films, which is welcome, but we also have things like the Troll. You don't really get a good look at its design, but for me, this shot felt the most out of place of the whole trailer, along with this Zack Snyder-esque slow motion jump, which is a trope I'm getting really bored of in modern action scenes and I don't think belongs in Middle-earth. That pretty much wraps up the trailer, but let me quickly address the music. Now, the trailer music was not written by Howard Shore, but he did do the music in the title reveal video, and Amazon have confirmed he is helping with the series. This was such a relief to hear, and it's a huge part of why I'm still optimistic about the series. For me, Howard Shore's music in the Lord of the Rings trilogy remains the single best musical score of any film, and it was a huge part of why those movies were able to so successfully bring the depth of Tolkien's vision to life. So that's what I think of the trailer. On the whole, I think the series looks and feels consistent with my mental image of Tolkien's world, even if some aspects seem more reminiscent of the more questionable style choices of The Hobbit than the timeless effects from the Rings trilogy. But I am still so excited to see the full story play out on screen, whatever that story ends up being. That said, there have been hints at things like the apparent coexistence of two Durins and the compressed time frame of the story that Tolkien geeks are right to be skeptical over. And that's not even touching the fact that Amazon don't actually have the rights to a lot of the source material for the Second Age. I totally understand the trepidation people have about the potential for too much narrative independence or creative license to be taken with such beloved and well-known characters. They are right to feel protective of this world, its history, and its people, and to demand nothing but the highest standards of adaptation. All I would say in response is that adaptation is an art, not a science, especially when dealing with an era of Middle-earth that does not have every detail fleshed out. Which brings us back, inevitably, to the Jackson Trilogy. Because don't forget that the Jackson Trilogy took heaps of creative liberties and departures from the books, in small ways and big ones. Some of these have been criticised, like the change of Faramir's character or omitting the scouring of the Shire, while others, like changing Glorfindel to Arwen in this scene or removing the 17-year gap between this moment and this one in the books, made total sense and were barely even noticed by all but the most ardent book fans. One of the most inspiring and iconic moments from the Rings films, Sam's speech at the end of the Two Towers, is completely different in the books. Pippin's lament for Faramir is a cheerful walking song that the hobbits sing while they're leaving the Shire. The whole scene filmed here with the 4 hobbits hiding from the Wraith is not in the books. Merry doesn't even join them until they reach the Brandywine Bridge. But all of these changes were justified and, dare I say it, improvements. My point is that what matters to me is not that the adaptation is a carbon copy of the source material. What matters is that when the adaptation does deviate from the source, it does so in a way that is still faithful to the original. On balance, I think the Jackson Trilogy got this right. In The Hobbit, I think these creative liberties and changes went too far, as did many of the production design and filmmaking choices. And I think that even with the trailer, it is still far too early to tell where the Rings of Power will fall on the spectrum until we have seen the whole thing, but both the trailer and the other accompanying material has given us reason to believe it could go either way. All I know is that I cannot wait to find out, because if they get it right, like Jackson did, it'll become more than a TV show. It'll become something that lasts forever.